was really into that book. So much so that his body is tensed, his arm is straining, and all of the muscles are flexed on his back. How do we handle a seated pose and then maybe something that has some foreshortening? Here's the head. Notice my wrapping line. Second thing to say is that the goal for gesture, at least for me, is never to make it match exactly. I don't really care about that too much. I understand if you do. I don't think there's conflict there. But if you see me mostly exaggerating diagonal direction or sometimes length, these are things that I would be doing now to emphasize the qualities of movement or what I feel to be dynamic or interesting, but could always be kind of softened or coaxed into having a bit more of a proximity to the reference if you want later on. Again, it's just a start. Okay, so what's happening here? Well, we have a figure that's leaning forward. So if we say that, we had that formulaic way of thinking gesture, the 4 lines through the body, and that I always use these lines in this configuration for standing poses. If you want to do a pose that's leaning down or over, what I would do is just switch them. So I can put this long one on the back and then make these short, more truncated lines on the front. So here, let's do that. Maybe I'll put like a big S curve on the back. So like that. And then on the front, if I do the thoracic line here, the lumbar line here, and then the pelvis line there, it kind of automatically creates that bend or that lean forward. And then we could use a few kind of wrapping lines just to suggest those perspectives. So this is really my ideal or my formula. I always try to develop something like that, something that would be a constant, when you're thinking about drawing or design or something like that. It doesn't mean you always have to do it that way. It just means that when you're drawing, you have one standard that you can think of, and then you could always from there make alterations, adjustments. Now, same thing here with the legs. If we look at the one we did prior real quick, the basic proportion that I would be looking for in most figures would be the pelvis is halfway. So this is a way you could kind of ultimately come back in and double check your proportions. I don't think, again, you'd want to spend too much time doing that early, but one way you could, if you do have some difficulty with proportion, and let's be honest, who doesn't, that if I start my gesture and work from head to the pelvis, whatever that length is, oftentimes I'll just double it and then make that the ground. And that way I can't overshoot the length of the legs. So that would be a half. That's also an 8 head figure, which is not realistic. It's ideal. That would put the knees at this half. So halfway between the pelvis and the floor would be the knees in an 8 head figure. So when the figure becomes foreshortened, I'm just going to be shortening these lengths. That's it. So gesture, the act of foreshortening would be to make the line itself shorter in length and then to over-exaggerate the quality of wrap with ellipses. So let's do that on this example. So the legs are not as long as they would be on that first. So if I'm doing the femur here, well, where does this one connect? Well, maybe that comes off of this one. Maybe it relates to this line and kind of that long rhythmic loomis sense, if that's what you're into. So I could put a femur here, but I'm going to make it shorter. And instead of giving it that long sweeping direction, I'm going to emphasize these. So remember, just 2 or 3 per part. What that tells me, because this is really for me and later an audience, is that the leg is moving forward at that angle. But I'm not at a stage where I want to kind of slow down and start putting cylinders all over the figures yet. I could do another curve here for that, the inside of the knee, and then maybe another C curve this way. Or you could have designed this also as one big C curve. I broke it up into the separate ones just so you could get a sense for how I'm thinking through the foreshortening. So maybe the lower leg also needs to have that quality of wrap, which is again summary for what's happening with that. The other thing you could do with foreshortening is push line weight. So if this is getting closer to me, I'll darken that. And then that brings that forward or makes it more important. The triple check would be, once I have a pathway established, let's say here from like head to foot, and you want to, am I doing this well? Is the gesture working? If that's your pathway, go back and just be critical, self-critical with your lines. Just see, does each line create that hand holding? Does it take me from one peak to the next and provide that asymmetrical back and forth all the way through? On this side, so here's my upper leg. This one's not too foreshortened, but just a little bit. So 1, how does that line relate to the total? Here's the knee. And then lower leg. Usually for my lower leg, I'll use an S curve. Oh, and then notice my foot on this side. Triangle. And then on this one, so that's kind of angled down because he has one on the rung of that stool. And then we could do a little bit of that 3/4, just so you start to set up the plane for that. Wrapping lines, go this way. And then arm. So how do I get to this arm? Well, let's put a shoulder line up here. And that kind of builds off that back stretch of the thoracic. So shoulder, upper arm, comes out. Probably want to put a lot of emphasis on this. Maybe we could darken line weight and make it significant so that it feels like there's weight on that thigh. And then this would be the forearm line. And that kind of goes back a little bit. It's a very intense book reading session that he's doing. He was really into that book, so much so that his body is tensed, that his arm is straining, and all of the muscles are flexed on his back. It's a strange gesture. So here's this arm coming down, forearm comes up, and then that very intense look at the book. So that would be done. I'd be ready to move into step 2, which would be looking for my tilts and then adding those shapes, those basic 2D masses on top.